The chandelier light scattered across crystal glasses and polished silver like the room itself had been trained never to make mistakes. 20 guests sat frozen behind polite smiles, watching the old money performance unfold exactly on schedule, until his voice cut through the air with surgical precision. "Without my last name, you're nobody." A sentence delivered softly enough to sound civilized, and cruel enough to stop every fork midair. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. She simply closed the black folder resting beside her plate and looked at him with the calm expression of someone who had already seen tomorrow's numbers. Outside, rain slid down the windows of the penthouse like liquid static. Inside, nobody noticed the CFO quietly leaving the table to answer a phone call that would change everything before sunrise. The rain over Manhattan looked expensive that night. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just cold, disciplined rain sliding down 43 floors of reinforced glass while black cars lined the entrance below like silent bodyguards waiting for instructions nobody questioned. Inside the Harrington residence, the annual family investment dinner was unfolding with mathematical precision. Crystal reflected warm amber light. String music floated invisibly through hidden speakers. Every chair had been assigned 3 weeks earlier by an assistant who treated seating charts like military operations, and at the center of it all sat Richard Harrington, the man financial magazines called the architect of modern acquisition strategy. 71 years old, silver hair, perfect posture, the kind of calm that only appears after decades of controlling rooms before entering them. People didn't interrupt Richard. They adjusted themselves around him. Even now, 20 guests moved carefully within the gravity of his approval. Hedge fund partners, board members, 2 politicians pretending not to discuss future regulations, a luxury hotel owner from Dubai, 3 attorneys who smiled only when necessary. Conversations rose and fell in controlled waves, but every few minutes eyes drifted back toward the head of the table, checking his expression like traders watching market signals. And beside him sat Elena, his daughter-in-law, the woman he never fully accepted, not because she lacked intelligence. That would have been easier, simpler, cleaner. No, Elena was dangerous for a much more uncomfortable reason. She succeeded quietly. No scandals, no desperate self-promotion, no dramatic speeches about leadership. She simply walked into broken systems and somehow left them profitable 6 months later. Entire departments stabilized around her presence the way unstable structures settle after reinforcement beams are installed. People trusted her too quickly. That bothered Richard more than he admitted, especially because Harrington Global had started depending on her in ways nobody openly discussed. Elena sat calmly in a dark emerald dress, one hand resting lightly near a closed black leather folder beside her plate. No jewelry except a thin gold watch, no exaggerated makeup, no visible attempt to compete with the polished social armor surrounding her. And somehow that made her stand out more. Across the table, Olivia Harrington, Richard's oldest daughter, watched Elena with the careful smile of someone waiting for an opportunity to become cruel without consequences. Olivia specialized in elegant humiliation, not loud humiliation, refined humiliation, the kind delivered through compliments sharp enough to draw blood later. "So, Elena," Olivia said lightly, swirling wine in her glass, "I heard the Singapore restructuring finally closed." Several guests glanced up. A trap had entered the room. Elena nodded once. "Yesterday morning." "And?" Olivia tilted her head innocently. Was it difficult managing something at that scale? There it was, the implication beneath the question. "You're still temporary here." Elena lifted her water glass slowly. "Complicated, yes." Richard smiled faintly without looking directly at her. "Complicated is one word for a $400 million instability risk." The table quieted slightly. Even the violin track overhead suddenly felt too loud. One of the attorneys cleared his throat and looked down at his plate. A hedge fund partner reached for his wine without drinking it. Tiny reactions, tiny fractures, the social equivalent of traders noticing smoke before a market crash. Elena remained composed. "That instability no longer exists," she said. Richard leaned back in his chair. "You're efficient," he admitted. I'll give you that. Not praise. Assessment. The difference mattered. Elena already knew what was coming. She could feel it forming beneath the conversation the way pressure changes before lightning arrives. Richard never wasted public settings unless he intended to make a point large enough for witnesses, and tonight he wanted witnesses. The rain intensified outside, tapping softly against the massive windows. Richard folded his hands. But let's not confuse operational usefulness with legacy. There it was, not a sentence, a blade. Several guests froze almost imperceptibly. Olivia lowered her eyes to hide the smile threatening to appear. Richard finally turned toward Elena fully, calm and precise. "Without my last name," he said, "you're nobody." Silence. Not ordinary silence. The expensive kind. The kind where nobody moves because everyone understands history is being recorded in real time. A waiter near the far wall stopped walking. One of the investors stared directly at his plate. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly across the skyline. Elena looked at Richard for exactly 3 seconds. No anger, no visible humiliation, which somehow made the moment worse. Then, very gently, she closed the black folder beside her plate. Click. The sound was quiet, but several people looked at it immediately, because something about that tiny motion felt final. Richard noticed too. "You disagree?" he asked calmly. Elena's expression barely shifted. "No." That answer caught him off guard. Olivia blinked. Richard narrowed his eyes slightly. "No?" Elena rested her hands lightly on the tablecloth. "I think names matter. They open doors." The tension loosened by perhaps 2%. Guests exhaled silently. A few even smiled nervously, hoping the moment would dissolve into civilized conversation again. But Elena continued. "And sometimes," she added softly, "they hide structural weaknesses long enough for everyone to stop noticing them." The room changed temperature. Not physically, socially. Richard's face remained composed, but something behind his eyes hardened with microscopic precision. A CFO seated halfway down the table suddenly became very interested in his phone screen because he understood exactly what that sentence meant. Most people at the table didn't, but the finance people did. Structural weaknesses, control dependencies, operational concentration, invisible authority chains, the kind of problems that don't appear dangerous, until one person quietly steps away and the entire machine begins discovering which parts were never actually stable. Richard smiled slowly. "A very corporate answer." Elena gave a small nod. "We are at a corporate dinner." A few restrained laughs appeared around the table, nervous and fragile. But Richard wasn't laughing anymore. He studied her the way experienced chess players study opponents after realizing the opening game failed. Interesting. Very interesting. Then his phone buzzed once against the table. He ignored it. 30 seconds later, it buzzed again. This time, the CFO across the table checked his own device simultaneously, and his expression changed immediately. Tiny shift. But Elena saw it. So did Richard. The CFO stood abruptly, trying not to appear abrupt. "Excuse me," he said carefully. "I need to take this." Richard's irritation surfaced instantly. "Now?" "I'm afraid so." The CFO left the dining room quickly, not running. People at that level never ran, but close. Very close. The conversations around the table restarted in fragmented pieces, everyone pretending the atmosphere hadn't just fractured in half. Wine poured again. Someone mentioned European markets. Another guest forced a laugh too loudly, but the rhythm was broken now, because everyone felt it. Something had entered the evening that wasn't supposed to exist. Uncertainty. Elena reached calmly for her water. Olivia leaned closer toward Richard. "Honestly, she's becoming dramatic." Elena heard it, ignored it. Richard kept watching her. Not emotionally, strategically. And for the first time that evening, a thought entered his mind that he didn't entirely enjoy. Why did she bring that folder? Outside, lightning flashed silently behind the glass skyline. Inside, Elena finally stood from the table. Smoothly, calmly. No performance. "I should head home," she said politely. So early? Olivia asked. Elena looked toward the rain-covered city beyond the windows. Tomorrow will be busy. Richard's gaze shifted briefly toward the closed folder still resting near her chair. Leaving that behind? Elena looked at it for 1 second, then back at him. No, she said softly. That's the only reason I came. And suddenly, for reasons nobody could yet explain, the room felt very, very quiet again. The elevator ride down from the penthouse lasted 43 seconds. Elena counted every one of them, not because she was nervous, because silence becomes extremely honest after public humiliation. And in that silence, details begin arranging themselves differently. Voices replay, expressions sharpen, tiny reactions suddenly reveal more than entire conversations. Richard's sentence still floated somewhere behind her eyes. Without my last name, you're nobody. Interesting thing about powerful men. Eventually, they confuse visibility with ownership. The elevator doors opened into the marble lobby with a soft, mechanical whisper. Outside, rain painted the city in distorted reflections, white headlights stretching across wet asphalt like fractured timelines. A valet hurried toward the entrance carrying an umbrella, but Elena raised one hand gently. I'm fine. She stepped into the rain alone. Cold air touched her face immediately. Not dramatic enough to feel cinematic, just real, sharp, awake. Her phone vibrated before she reached the curb. Martin Keller, CFO. She answered calmly. You left quickly, she said. On the other end, Martin exhaled once. She could hear traffic behind him, fast movement, stress carefully restrained beneath executive professionalism. You already knew? I suspected. A pause. Then, the Singapore transfer triggered an overnight compliance escalation. Elena stopped walking beneath the glow of a street lamp. Rain tapped softly against her coat. And? Martin lowered his voice instinctively, even over the phone. The ownership transition file surfaced earlier than expected. Across the street, a taxi splashed through rainwater without slowing down. Elena closed her eyes briefly. Earlier than expected. Interesting. Who has seen it? She asked. 3 people officially, maybe 6 unofficially. That's fast. Richard doesn't know yet. Another pause. Then Martin added carefully, but he will. A black SUV rolled slowly past her before disappearing into traffic. Above the city, thunder moved somewhere far beyond the skyline. Elena resumed walking. How unstable! Martin gave a dry laugh without humor. You want the CFO answer or the honest answer? The honest one. The board will panic by morning. That sentence hung between them, heavy, measured, real, because Harrington Global wasn't built like ordinary corporations. Publicly, yes, there were shares, structures, governance layers, committees, regulatory frameworks. But privately? Control operated through influence networks, legacy voting pathways, inherited trust agreements, strategic dependency chains, invisible architecture disguised as tradition. And tonight, part of that architecture had quietly shifted. A $400 million shift. Not cash, control. Far more dangerous. Elena reached the corner intersection and stopped beneath the red traffic light. Rainwater slid down illuminated advertising screens above the avenue. Somewhere nearby, music drifted from a rooftop bar filled with people still young enough to think expensive cocktails could solve loneliness. Martin spoke again. The revised authority map changes everything. Not everything. Enough. She didn't answer immediately. Cars passed in silver streams beside her. Finally, she asked, Has legal reviewed the succession exposure? Another pause. Longer this time. That's the problem. Elena already knew, but she let him say it anyway. Martin's voice dropped lower. The succession exposure points directly at Richard. The city suddenly felt quieter. Not literally, psychologically, because some sentences alter spatial perception when you hear them. Elena. Yes? If this becomes public before the board briefing tomorrow, he exhaled carefully. This company is going to discover very quickly who actually holds operational stability. A green light appeared overhead. Pedestrians moved around her in blurred motion while she remained still. Then Elena smiled faintly. Not satisfaction, recognition. Because for 3 years she had watched executives treat invisible labor like oxygen, important but forgettable. The systems she stabilized, the negotiations she prevented from collapsing, the international relationships she repaired quietly before shareholders ever sensed instability. People praised outcomes, rarely infrastructure, until infrastructure moved. Then suddenly, everyone remembered where the load-bearing walls were hidden. "Send me the revised report," Elena said. "You already have it." She looked down briefly at the black leather folder under her arm. Of course she did. Martin hesitated again before speaking. "There's another issue." "There's always another issue." The Zurich partners delayed their signature pending clarification. That got her attention. Her pace slowed. Pending clarification of what? Martin answered carefully. "Who actually controls strategic operations now?" There it was, the sentence underneath all the other sentences. Not who owns the company, who controls movement. In large corporations, those were very different things, and sophisticated investors knew it. Elena looked up toward the skyline where Harrington Tower still glowed against the storm clouds like an illuminated monument to certainty. Funny thing about monuments, most collapse long before they realize erosion already started. "When did Zurich call?" she asked. 8 minutes after dinner began. Meaning, while Richard was humiliating her publicly, international partners were already questioning internal control stability privately. The irony almost felt artistic. Martin continued, "And there's something else you should know." "Elaborate." "The board members aren't scared about losing money." Elena crossed the street slowly. "They're scared because the dependency audit became visible. Now that mattered, because dependency audits were corporate X-rays. They revealed the uncomfortable truth hidden beneath polished executive mythology, which people actually kept the machine alive. And according to the latest audit, too many critical systems pointed toward Elena. Not ceremonially, operationally. Silence settled between them for several seconds. Then Martin asked the question he'd been avoiding since the call began. "Did you plan this?" Elena smiled faintly beneath the rain. "No." "You're sure?" "Yes." "Because the timing feels almost surgical." She stopped beneath the awning of a closed cafe. Water dripped rhythmically from the edge above her. Then, softly, she answered, "Martin, powerful people create their own timing problems when they start believing loyalty is permanent." Another silence. This one longer. He understood exactly what she meant. Inside Harrington Global, Elena had become something extremely rare. A person trusted across incompatible departments. Legal trusted her. Operations trusted her. International partners trusted her. Mid-level managers trusted her. Even employees who had never met her trusted the systems she quietly repaired behind the scenes. And Richard? Richard mistook that trust for inheritance by proximity. A dangerous mistake. Martin finally spoke again. "The board emergency session starts at 7:30. "I know. You should be there." "I will." "And Richard?" Elena looked back once toward the distant tower glowing through the rain. "He'll be there too." She ended the call. For a moment, the city moved around her without meaning. Tires hissing across wet pavement. Neon reflecting across puddles. People rushing home beneath umbrellas, unaware that somewhere high above them, a billion-dollar corporate structure had just begun discovering the difference between authority and dependence. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was a message. Unknown number. Only 4 words. "He doesn't know yet." Elena stared at the screen. Then another message arrived immediately after. "But by morning. Everyone will." And somewhere 43 floors above the city, Richard Harrington finally picked up the phone call he should have answered an hour earlier. If you've ever watched powerful people mistake silence for weakness, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because the next chapter changes everything. Emergency boardrooms, hidden voting rights, and a control report nobody was supposed to see before sunrise. And trust me, when the CFO opens the final file, the room goes completely silent. At 7:12 a.m., the executive floor of Harrington Global looked unnaturally calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that exists right before markets open after catastrophic international news. Assistants moved faster than usual but spoke quieter. Security staff suddenly occupied positions nobody normally noticed. Elevator doors opened and closed with mechanical precision while phones vibrated nonstop across polished conference tables, and behind every controlled expression lived the same question. How bad is it? Rain still covered Manhattan in a pale gray haze when Elena stepped out of the private elevator carrying the same black leather folder from the dinner. 3 people stopped talking when they saw her. Not dramatically, instantly, because corporate panic has its own body language. A junior analyst exiting the finance wing nearly collided with the glass door after recognizing her. 2 legal advisors exchanged a quick glance loaded with unspoken calculations. Even the receptionist straightened unconsciously. Interesting. By now, the rumors were already mutating faster than facts. That always happened inside large systems. Information traveled like electricity through fear. Someone hears control shift, someone else hears ownership dispute, and by sunrise, half the building imagines federal investigations and emergency resignations. Reality was more sophisticated, which made it far more dangerous. Elena continued walking through the executive corridor without changing pace. Black heels against marble, controlled, quiet. Every movement deliberate enough to look effortless. Behind the glass walls lining the hallway, dozens of employees pretended not to watch her pass. Pretended badly, because people sense structural instability before leadership does. They feel it in email tone changes, in unscheduled meetings, in the sudden appearance of attorneys before breakfast. And this morning, Harrington Global felt like a luxury aircraft discovering tiny cracks at 30,000 feet, still flying, but no longer untouchable. Near the boardroom entrance, Martin Keller stood reviewing documents beside 2 exhausted-looking compliance officers. His tie was slightly uneven, a microscopic detail almost nobody would notice. Elena noticed immediately, meaning he hadn't slept. Martin looked up as she approached. For half a second, relief crossed his face. Then professionalism returned. They moved the meeting forward. 2? 7:20. Why? Martin gave a dry smile. Because Richard arrived early. Of course he did. Richard Harrington never arrived early unless he intended to regain control before other people understood it had weakened. How much does he know? Elena asked quietly. Martin lowered his voice. Enough to be furious, not enough to understand the scale. That distinction mattered enormously, because anger creates noise. But fear creates precision. The boardroom doors remained closed ahead of them. Frosted glass concealed the silhouettes moving inside like shadows behind expensive theater curtains. Martin handed Elena a thin stack of updated reports. Zurich officially suspended signature authorization at 6:42. She scanned the page once. And Seoul? Waiting. Dubai? Watching. A dangerous word in corporate diplomacy. Watching meant investors weren't reacting yet. They were measuring weakness first. Elena closed the report. And dependency exposure? Martin hesitated, then handed her another file separately. Thicker, red-tabbed. Ah, that one. The real problem. Not the ownership shift itself, the operational concentration audit attached to it. Elena opened the first page briefly while Martin watched carefully. Rows of divisions, regional systems, executive access pathways, approval chains, crisis authorization structures. And beside an alarming number of them, the same name appeared repeatedly. Elena Voronina Harrington. Not because she demanded power, because over time, people routed critical decisions toward the person who solved problems fastest. Organizations always do that eventually. Efficiency attracts dependency the way gravity attracts mass. The danger only becomes visible later. When someone asks, what happens if that person stops? Martin rubbed his forehead tiredly. Legal believes the board underestimated your operational footprint by almost 40%. Elena looked up slowly. 40? They're still recalculating. From inside the boardroom, raised voices suddenly became audible through the glass. Richard, sharp, controlled. Dangerous. Another voice answered defensively. Then silence again. Martin exhaled carefully. He thinks someone orchestrated this. Someone did. Martin frowned slightly. Elena closed the folder. Years of executive arrogance orchestrated it. For the first time that morning, Martin almost smiled. Almost. Before he could answer, the boardroom doors opened abruptly. Richard Harrington stepped out. Perfect suit, perfect posture, perfect control, except for the eyes. The eyes gave him away. Not panic, something rarer. Disorientation. Because powerful men can tolerate opposition. They understand enemies, lawsuits, competition, betrayal. But dependency? Dependency humiliates them, especially when it becomes measurable. The hallway immediately fell silent. Every assistant nearby suddenly found urgent reasons to study tablets and documents instead of looking directly at him. Richard's gaze locked onto Elena instantly. Cold. Exact. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Richard dismissed the others with a glance sharp enough to function like an order. Compliance officers vanished almost immediately. Martin stepped backward carefully toward the side corridor. Soon, only the two of them remained near the glass wall overlooking the rain-covered skyline. Richard spoke first. "What did you do?" Straight to the point. "Interesting." Elena rested the folder lightly against the table beside her. "You'll need to be more specific." "The transfer exposure?" "Legal." "The Zurich hesitation?" "Predictable." "The audit?" "That one surprised even me." Richard studied her carefully. He was searching now, not for facts, for intent, because intent changes negotiation dynamics. If Elena planned this, then she was an opponent. If she didn't, then the situation might be worse, because uncontrolled structural failure cannot be reasoned with. "You embarrassed me last night," he said quietly. Elena tilted her head slightly. "No, Richard. Not father-in-law. Not Mr. Harrington. Richard, you embarrassed yourself." The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop instantly. A junior assistant entering from the far corridor froze mid-step before silently retreating backward. Richard's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "You think this company exists because of operational reports?" "I think this company survives because someone notices problems before investors do." "And you believe that someone is you?" Elena looked directly through the glass toward the city below. "No," she answered calmly. "The audit believes that." That hit harder than anger would have, because it was objective, documented, quantified. Richard stepped closer. "You're enjoying this." Finally, Elena looked back at him, and for the first time since the dinner, a faint emotion appeared behind her calm expression. Disappointment. Not revenge, not triumph. Worse. "You still don't understand what's happening," she said softly. Richard stared at her in silence. Elena opened the black folder slowly and removed one final document. Only one page. She handed it to him. Richard scanned the first paragraph confidently. Then the confidence disappeared. Not dramatically, systematically. His eyes moved lower across the page, stopped, read the line again. And suddenly the hallway no longer looked large enough for the amount of silence inside it. Because the document wasn't a resignation. It was a continuity risk assessment. Official. Board authorized. And directly beneath the highlighted section appeared a sentence capable of destabilizing an entire corporate dynasty. Removal, alienation, or operational disengagement of Elena Voronina. Harrington may trigger immediate strategic instability across 6 international divisions. Richard looked up slowly. For the first time in decades, he seemed older than the building around him. And before he could speak, the boardroom doors opened behind them. One of the directors stepped into the hallway, pale-faced, holding a phone in trembling fingers. "Richard," he said carefully, "we have another problem." Richard didn't look away from Elena. "What now?" The director swallowed once. "The Asian markets just reacted to the leak." Silence. Then, very quietly, "47 billion in exposure is now under review." For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. Not Richard, not the director. Not even the assistants pretending not to listen from behind nearby glass partitions. Because under review was one of those corporate phrases designed to sound harmless while quietly containing the emotional equivalent of a building alarm. $47 billion in exposure under review meant one thing. The world had started doubting Harrington Global in real time, and doubt spreads faster than facts ever will. The director holding the phone looked visibly uncomfortable remaining in the hallway between Richard and Elena, like a man who accidentally stepped into the center of a sniper line. "The Tokyo call starts in 11 minutes, he added carefully. "Zurich wants confirmation before markets fully open." Richard finally turned toward him. "Who leaked it?" Wrong question. Elena noticed immediately. When systems begin destabilizing, insecure leaders search for traitors before vulnerabilities. It gives the illusion of control. A villain feels manageable. Structural weakness does not. The director hesitated. "We don't know yet." Richard's expression hardened further. "Find out." Then he walked past both of them toward the boardroom without another word. But Elena caught it, that microscopic change in pace, half a second slower than normal. Richard Harrington was beginning to realize something profoundly unpleasant. This situation was no longer moving at his speed. Inside the boardroom, 12 executives sat around a 40-foot black conference table polished so perfectly it reflected ceiling lights like dark water. Multiple screens glowed along the walls displaying market feeds, regional exposure maps, legal notifications, and investor alerts arriving faster than assistants could categorize them. Nobody touched the catered breakfast. Coffee, however, was disappearing aggressively. As Elena entered beside Martin, conversations lowered instantly. Some executives looked relieved to see her. Others looked nervous about being seen looking relieved. Important distinction. At the far end of the table, Richard remained standing, dominating space by instinct. The massive screen behind him displayed one flashing headline from a private international terminal. Harrington Global Control Structure under internal review. Minimal wording. Maximum damage. One of the board members, a gray-haired private equity veteran named Samuel Reed, removed his glasses slowly. "We need immediate clarification," he said. "Now!" Richard answered before anyone else could speak. "The company remains stable." Samuel didn't blink. "Then why are international partners delaying authorization?" "Temporary uncertainty." "Temporary uncertainty cost us 12 points in pre-market confidence overnight." Another board member leaned forward. "And Tokyo's demanding operational assurances tied specifically to Elena." There it was again. Not tied to Richard, not tied to the Harrington family. To Elena. The room felt tighter after that sentence. Richard's tone sharpened slightly. "Operational confidence is not the same as executive dependency." Martin quietly slid a document across the table. "Naturally," he said. Several board members opened the report simultaneously. Then silence spread outward in stages. One executive sat back immediately. Another muttered something under his breath. Someone near the legal division whispered, "Jesus Christ," because the report quantified something nobody wanted quantified. Over the last 3 years, Elena had become the invisible stabilizer across multiple international sectors simultaneously. Supply chain recovery, partner retention, regulatory negotiations, cross-border restructuring, crisis arbitration, executive mediation. Half the company's emergency pathways quietly routed through her authority before reaching Richard's office at all. Not by formal decree, by efficiency evolution. Systems adapted around competence, and now those systems were visible. Samuel Reed looked toward Richard slowly. "You knew about this?" Richard remained standing. No system becomes indispensable accidentally. Elena finally spoke. "No," she said calmly. "It becomes indispensable when leadership repeatedly ignores infrastructure until only one person keeps repairing it." A dangerous sentence. Not emotional. Verifiable. The legal counsel near the center of the table adjusted her glasses carefully. "The issue isn't only dependency." Everyone looked toward her. She opened another section of the report. "There's also the revised voting alignment." "Ah, that one. The real earthquake." Richard's expression darkened instantly. One by one, board members turned pages, and one by one, their faces changed, because beneath layers of subsidiaries, restructuring vehicles, transitional trusts, and international holding adjustments, something deeply uncomfortable had emerged during the overnight audit. Control pathways had shifted, not illegally, not secretly, contractually, every signature valid, every clause enforceable. But the final structure created a scenario almost nobody anticipated. Samuel looked directly at Elena. "You have indirect blocking authority?" Elena answered honestly. "Yes." Another silence. Sharp this time. Electric. Because blocking authority at that level didn't mean ownership. It meant something far more dangerous. No major strategic movement could proceed cleanly without her cooperation. Across the table, Olivia Harrington entered the room late, still carrying her phone. Her confidence disappeared almost instantly after seeing the expressions around her. What happened? Nobody answered immediately. Samuel finally slid the report toward her. Olivia skimmed the first page casually, then stopped, read slower, then slower again. Color drained from her face with astonishing speed. "That's impossible," the legal counsel answered quietly. "It's fully enforceable." Olivia looked toward Richard instinctively, expecting immediate denial. Instead, she found silence, and that frightened her more. Outside the glass walls, the executive floor moved like a disturbed anthill. Employees rushed between departments, security protocols updated in real time, financial media requests multiplied by the minute. Inside the room, the atmosphere had transformed completely. This was no longer about humiliation at a family dinner. This was about succession exposure, about invisible power, about discovering the difference between public leadership and operational gravity. Martin's phone vibrated again. He checked the screen. His face changed immediately. Samuel noticed first. "What is it?" Martin hesitated. Richard's patience snapped slightly. "Speak." Martin looked toward Elena once before answering. "The Zurich partners just issued a conditional continuation notice." The room froze again. Samuel leaned forward. "Conditional on what?" Martin swallowed carefully, then read directly from the message. "Strategic continuity assurances must include formal retention guarantees regarding Elena Voronina Harrington." Nobody spoke. Even the air conditioning suddenly sounded loud. Olivia looked horrified. One board member actually laughed once under his breath, not because anything was funny, but because sometimes people laugh when reality becomes too structurally absurd to process normally. Richard stared at the table in absolute silence, and for the first time in his entire career, the room around him had stopped orbiting his authority. It was orbiting risk instead. Then Elena quietly closed her folder. The sound echoed far louder than it should have. Click. Every eye turned toward her instantly. Elena stood slowly, calm as ever. No victory smile, no dramatic performance, which somehow made the moment infinitely more unsettling. "I think," she said softly, "everyone finally understands the difference between a family name and a load-bearing wall." No one answered, because deep down, every person in that room knew the terrifying part wasn't the control shift. The terrifying part was this: she hadn't threatened anyone, and the company was still falling toward her gravity anyway. By 11:40 a.m., financial media helicopters were circling above Midtown, not because Harrington Global had collapsed, because it hadn't. Yet. That was always the moment investors feared most. The space between visible stability and invisible failure. Markets can survive bad news. They struggle with uncertainty. But dependency exposure tied to leadership fractures? That kind of story spreads through institutions like smoke through ventilation systems. You don't see the fire immediately. You just realize breathing changed. Inside Harrington Tower, conference rooms filled faster than calendars could update. Legal teams occupied entire floors. Compliance officers carried stacks of printed reports like emergency responders transporting medical scans after an accident nobody fully understood yet. And everywhere, one sentence kept repeating in whispers: "She has blocking authority." Different tone every time. Fear, Admiration, confusion, sometimes all three together. Elena stood alone near the eastern glass wall overlooking the river, watching gray clouds drag slowly across Manhattan. Her reflection floated faintly against the skyline. Calm posture, dark coat, loose strands of hair moving slightly in the conditioned air. Her phone had not stopped vibrating for almost 2 hours. International calls, board requests, private messages, 3 recruitment offers disguised as informal conversations. One venture group from London had offered her an emergency dinner before noon. Interesting how quickly loyalty becomes networking when power shifts direction. Behind her, the executive floor moved with restrained panic. Nobody ran. People at this level never run. But they accelerated elegantly. Martin approached carrying another tablet and 2 printed folders. He looked worse than earlier. Fatigue had finally reached his eyes. "You need to see this." Elena turned slightly. More exposure? More reactions. He handed her the tablet first. Financial analysts, partner advisories, private institutional memos. Most used careful language, but the message underneath remained identical. Harrington Global may no longer control its own operational center. One analyst phrased it even more brutally. Leadership authority appears symbolic compared to functional dependency concentration. Elena almost smiled. Corporate analysts had a talent for making emotional disasters sound academically elegant. Martin lowered his voice. The board's splitting. That mattered. How badly? 3 groups. Predictable. Continue. Martin opened the first folder. Group 1 supports Richard publicly no matter what. Legacy loyalists? Yes. The second? They want immediate stabilization through negotiated restructuring. Translation: keep the company alive first, discuss pride later. And the third group? Elena asked quietly. Martin hesitated. Then, they think you should take operational control temporarily. The city beyond the windows seemed to pause for 1 second. Not because of the sentence itself, because of how calmly it had been spoken. Temporary control. Those 2 words destroy families faster than lawsuits ever do. Elena looked back toward the skyline. No. Martin blinked once. No. I'm not interested in taking his chair. That may not matter anymore. Another interesting sentence. Because Martin wasn't talking about ambition now. He was talking about gravity. Systems under pressure move toward perceived stability automatically. Investors, boards, legal departments, international partners, they all begin searching for the same thing at once. Who reduces risk fastest? And right now, every answer pointed toward Elena, not by marketing, by pattern recognition. Martin rubbed his forehead again. Richard's losing the room. Not yet. You didn't see the last session. Elena turned toward him fully now. Martin gave a tired exhale. He spent 40 minutes trying to identify who leaked the audit instead of addressing the continuity issue. There it was, the fatal executive instinct. Protect image first, repair infrastructure second. And the board noticed. Martin continued quietly. Samuel Reed interrupted him twice. That's unusual. He practically accused Richard of confusing ownership with operational relevance. Elena looked down briefly at the tablet in her hands. Numbers, exposure charts, partner volatility indexes, all of it orbiting one invisible truth nobody wanted to say directly. Harrington Global had spent years building prestige around the family name while quietly building functionality around Elena. And now both structures had collided. A sudden commotion near the western corridor interrupted the silence. Voices, fast footsteps. Then Olivia appeared moving toward them at remarkable speed for someone usually so composed. Her makeup remained perfect. Her expression did not. Elena. Not cold this time, not elegant, urgent. Elena waited calmly. Olivia stopped in front of her, breathing slightly harder than she wanted anyone to notice. My father wants to speak with you privately. Martin instinctively stepped backward. Elena studied Olivia carefully. Something had changed. The superiority was gone. In its place lived something much more honest. Fear. Privately? Elena asked. Olivia nodded quickly. Before the emergency vote? Interesting, very interesting, because Richard Harrington did not request private conversations when he believed he controlled outcomes. He summoned people, different energy entirely. Elena handed the tablet back to Martin. Where is he? My grandfather's office. Not the executive conference room, not the legal floor, the private family office on the top level. Ah, so this was no longer purely corporate. This had become dynastic. As Elena walked toward the private elevator, the executive floor gradually quieted around her again. Employees pretended to work while tracking her movement through reflections in glass walls and laptop screens. Some looked hopeful, some terrified. Most simply looked uncertain, because institutions built around powerful personalities always fracture strangely when invisible structures become visible overnight. Inside the elevator, Olivia finally spoke again. You planned this better than I thought. Elena looked at her reflection in the mirrored wall. I didn't plan it. That's worse. The elevator climbed silently, floor numbers rising one by one like a countdown nobody could stop. Olivia folded her arms tightly. You know what people are saying downstairs? I can imagine. They think the company depends on you more than on him. Elena answered without hesitation. The company depends on systems. Olivia laughed once, short, sharp, tired. No, she said quietly. That's what normal corporations do. The elevator stopped. Private level. Restricted access. The doors opened slowly onto a hallway almost nobody outside the Harrington family had ever seen. Dark wood panels, museum-level silence. Old photographs lining the walls like preserved proof of generational authority. Founders, acquisitions, political handshakes, historic mergers, a shrine to legacy. At the end of the corridor, double doors stood partially open. Warm light spilled across the floor, and inside, Richard Harrington stood alone beside the window overlooking Manhattan. No assistants, no attorneys, no board members. Just him. For the first time all day, he looked tired, not physically, structurally, like a man discovering the architecture around him had changed while he was still living inside the old blueprint. Olivia stopped near the doorway. I'll wait outside. Then she disappeared, leaving the doors half open behind Elena. Silence settled across the office. Richard didn't turn around immediately. Below them, Manhattan moved in distant silver lines beneath the rain. Finally, without looking at her, he spoke. You know what my father told me the day I took control of this company? Elena remained still. Richard's reflection stared back from the glass. He said, never allow anyone to become more necessary than the family itself. A bitter smile crossed his face. And somehow, I did exactly that. The room became very quiet after that, because for the first time since the dinner began the night before, Richard Harrington had finally stopped speaking like a chairman and started speaking like a man who understood he might already be too late.